His own son looked him dead in the eye and sneered. It was yesterday just for real family. In that instant the world tilted, the years of sacrifice erased with a single cruel smirk. The father stood frozen, his heart pounding, realizing he had been cast aside not by strangers but by the very blood he had raised. The betrayal burned deeper than any wound, the humiliation cutting sharper than a knife. Viewers, what would you do if your child treated you like this? Drop a simple number or where you're watching from in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe before the story takes its next shocking turn. The room around him seemed to shrink, the silence pressing against his chest as if the air itself had turned heavy with betrayal. His son's words still rang in his ears, sharp as shattered glass. It was yesterday just for real family. He felt the echo crawl down into his bones, colder than winter wind. And suddenly every sacrifice he had ever made began to replay like a cruel film in his mind. Long nights spent in steel-toed boots, his hands cracked from labor, taking overtime shifts until his vision blurred so that his boy could have new shoes for school. The years when he skipped meals just to make sure tuition checks cleared when the mortgage consumed nearly every dollar he brought home. Each dollar was wrestled from exhaustion, every bill paid with sweat, and he had never once complained. He had promised himself his son would never grow up lacking the way he had. And now that son, polished in a new suit, smiling with someone else's family, had erased all of it with one smirk. He remembered when the boy was 7, standing in the cold yard with a bike that leaned too heavy to one side. He had jogged beside him, one hand gripping the seat, steadying the wobble. The boy had looked back, eyes wide with fear, and he had said, "Don't worry, I won't let you fall." He hadn't. But somehow, years later, the boy had let him fall, and the ground this time was harder than concrete. He thought of high school football games where he cheered from the bleachers, despite aching joints of the graduation day, when his chest had swelled with pride, thinking all of it had been worth it. Now that memory felt like a cruel trick, as if pride had been nothing but the setup for a deeper humiliation. His fingers curled into fists at his sides. He could still feel the raw ache of lifting lumber onto trucks, the sting of hot asphalt on his skin in July, the weight of debts he had carried so his son could walk free of them. He remembered the year he nearly lost the house, pulling double shifts through Christmas while his co-workers celebrated with their children so that his boy could wake up to gifts under a tree. He had hidden the overdue notices, smiling through exhaustion, and told himself it didn't matter as long as his son smiled. Every sacrifice had been currency for a future he believed would be shared. But standing there now, staring at the cold face of the man his son had become, he felt the bitter taste of a truth too sharp to ignore. None of it mattered. Not to him. Not anymore. The bitterness slid deeper with each second. His son's wife Linda hovered in the background, her painted smile sharp as a blade, while her parents David and Susan looked on with smug detachment. They hadn't lifted a hand to raise him, hadn't paid a single cent toward his future. But here they stood, basking in a victory that wasn't theirs to claim. He could feel the weight of their judgment as if he were the outsider in his own bloodline. The humiliation tightened in his chest, every beat of his heart reminding him of the years he had carried the family on his shoulders, only to be tossed aside like a burden they were relieved to shed. His gaze drifted past them unfocused, landing on nothing and everything all at once. He thought of his late nights at the kitchen table, bills spread out in uneven stacks, pencil worn to the nub as he calculated how to stretch one paycheck across too many demands. He remembered turning down vacations, skipping new clothes, driving the same rusted pickup, until the floor nearly gave out beneath his boots, all so his son could have what he had never known. And for what? To be told he wasn't real family. The ache spread through him like fire in reverse burning cold, searing from the inside out. He had never asked for recognition, never demanded gratitude. But this erasure, this rewriting of history, cut deeper than any lack of thanks. They had drawn a line in the sand, and they had placed him on the wrong side of it. The man who had given everything was now nothing in their eyes. He lifted his head slowly, letting the silence drag, watching their eyes flicker between smugness and unease. There was no rage spilling out, no shouting, only a stillness so sharp it carried more weight than any raised voice ever could. He had learned long ago that storms could be quiet, and sometimes the quiet ones did the most damage. He breathed deep, tasting the iron edge of resolve forming in the back of his throat. The bitterness no longer felt like despair. It was sharpening into something else, something steadier. Every memory of sacrifice that had once filled him with warmth now became steel forged into something unbreakable. They thought they had humiliated him, crushed him, erased him. What they had done instead was ignite something they would not be able to extinguish. He turned slightly, his eyes sweeping the room one last time, memorizing the smug curve of Linda's smile, the false courtesy of David's nod, the quiet gloating in Susan's gaze. His son's face, once innocent and dependent, was now a mask of arrogance. He carved each image into memory like etchings on stone, because he knew he would need them later. He wanted to remember exactly who had stood against him when the time came. His hand brushed against the frame of an old photograph set on the mantel, one of those cheap studio portraits taken decades earlier. A younger version of himself, arm draped proudly around a boy no taller than his waist. Both of them smiling wide, oblivious to the weight of the years ahead. He felt the sting rise behind his eyes but forced it down. That father was gone. The man standing here now had been remade by betrayal. The silence thickened once more, the weight of everything unsaid pressing harder than any words could. He let it linger just long enough for discomfort to ripple across their faces before he gave the faintest smile. Not the warmth of a father, not the softness of forgiveness, but the thin curve of someone who had already stepped onto a different path. They thought the pain they inflicted would end him. They believed his silence was surrender. They had no idea it was the beginning. What none of them knew was that every hour of labor, every dollar, saved every secret he had kept for decades, had given him far more than they could ever imagine. And soon, when the time was right, they would learn the cost of erasing the man who had built the very foundation they stood on. The ache in his chest no longer felt like weakness. It pulsed with something darker, something colder, something far more dangerous. They had stripped him of his place at the table, but they had handed him something far greater in return: clarity. He would not beg for belonging. He would not plead for recognition. He would watch, wait, and when the moment came he would strike with precision they would never see coming. And as he walked out into the night, the shadows swallowing his figure, the bitter taste of betrayal sharpened into a vow only he could hear. The story was not over, not by a long shot. The real reckoning was only just beginning. He stood in the corner of the room watching his son Michael adjust the cuffs of his pressed white shirt, as though preparing for a photograph, not a confrontation. Linda's hand lingered possessively on his arm, her eyes cutting toward the older man with a disdain so practiced it looked rehearsed. Around them, the chatter of friends and distant relatives hummed, the laughter of glasses clinking, the soft scrape of forks against plates. Yet not a single voice was raised in greeting for him. He may as well have been a shadow in his own bloodline's gathering. Michael shifted his weight, glancing once at his father as though he were a stranger who had wandered into the wrong house. No embrace, no acknowledgement, not even the smallest gesture of respect. Just that cold indifference sharpened by Linda's quiet smirk. Her parents, David and Susan, sat close by, perfectly at ease in the glow of their daughter's triumph, treating the man who had given his son everything as if he were an intruder who had overstayed his welcome. He tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. The words tasted bitter, and he swallowed them back, unwilling to give them the satisfaction of seeing his struggle. A waiter passed by with a tray of champagne, and the father instinctively reached for a glass, but the young man didn't stop. His arm swerved around him as though he were invisible, offering instead to the gleaming circle surrounding Linda's family. The humiliation pressed tighter against his chest. He wasn't just excluded, he was erased. Every sound in the room became louder, sharper. The clicking heels on marble, the exaggerated laughter, the distant echo of a piano melody playing in the next room. All of it pressed into him, reminding him with every note that he didn't belong. His gaze fell to the empty chair at the edge of the table. No name card, no reserved place, just a folding seat pushed against the wall. That was what they had left for him, if anything at all. He thought of the years when Michael was a boy, the late nights when he would creep into his father's bed after a nightmare. He would curl against him whispering that he was afraid, and the father would hold him until dawn, never once complaining, never once turning him away. That boy had needed him then, and he had been proud to give everything. But this man standing across the room, his son in name only, had no need for the father who had built his foundation brick by brick. Linda laughed at something her mother whispered, her hand tightening around Michael's arm as if staking her claim not only on him, but on the very future his father had once protected. The sound sliced through the father's chest, a reminder that his sacrifices had been transferred like currency into someone else's pocket. They weren't even subtle. Their gloating was polished, performed, and deliberate. The father shifted his stance, his knuckles whitening as his grip tightened around nothing at all. He felt the weight of every eye that didn't look at him, of every conversation that curved away before it reached his ears. He wasn't a guest. He wasn't family. He was furniture in the background, tolerated only because it couldn't be moved without effort, and still he said nothing. He let the silence stretch, let the indifference deepen. He had learned long ago that silence can wound deeper than words, that invisibility can hollow out a man faster than any insult. Yet, in that very silence, something else stirred. Not despair this time, but the dangerous clarity of humiliation turned into steel. Michael finally looked at him, a glance so fleeting, it might have been accidental, but the message was carved sharp beneath it. Stay quiet. Stay small. Stay out of sight. The father held his gaze for half a second longer than necessary, long enough to see the flicker of discomfort in his son's eyes, long enough to remind him that silence was not weakness. When a toast was raised, glasses lifted high, his hands remained at his sides. He didn't move. He didn't drink. He simply watched, eyes burning into the circle that had shut him out. He caught Linda's smirk again, her lips curling with satisfaction as if she had won some unspoken war. David leaned in to whisper to Susan, both of them chuckling softly, their eyes darting toward him, as though sharing a private joke at his expense. It was then he understood the depth of their game. It wasn't just indifference. It was a performance designed to strip him of dignity, to make him small in the eyes of everyone who mattered. They wanted him humiliated. They wanted him broken. But humiliation doesn't always break a man. Sometimes it reforges him. The father straightened his spine, letting the scene unfold as though he were merely an observer. His silence was no longer heavy with pain. It was sharp and deliberate, a weapon waiting to be drawn. Every laugh that excluded him, every sidelong glance, every deliberate snub, was being recorded, etched into memory with precision. They thought they had diminished him to nothing more than a ghost, haunting the edges of their celebration. They didn't see the fire building beneath the surface, the patience of a man who had spent his life enduring, who knew how to wait, who understood the art of timing. The room glittered with false light, crystal glasses catching chandeliers, polished shoes sliding across marble floors. To them, it was triumph. To him, it was theater, and he had seen enough plays to know the curtain never stays closed forever. He stood still, unflinching, watching the scene as though it belonged to someone else. Yet every beat of his heart drove the truth deeper into his veins. They had not erased him. They had only given him clarity. And as the music swelled and the laughter rose, he smiled, the faintest smile no one noticed. The kind of smile that doesn't beg for inclusion, doesn't plead for acceptance. It was the smile of a man who had decided the game wasn't over, not by a long shot. Because when humiliation hardens into resolve, it doesn't vanish. It waits. It sharpens. And sooner than they realized, it would strike. The low murmur of voices floated across the room, quiet enough to suggest secrecy, sharp enough to slice through the father's composure. He didn't need to strain to catch the words, because betrayal never whispers softly, it carries even when it's meant to be hidden. Linda leaned toward her mother, her painted lips brushing against Susan's ear. Her voice edged with venom dressed up as civility. "He's just here for appearances. Michael will see to it soon enough." Susan gave a thin smile, the kind that carried no warmth, only agreement. David shifted in his seat, adjusting the cuff of his tailored jacket, and added under his breath, "He's had his time. Now it's our turn to handle things." The father's pulse thudded in his ears. Every syllable burned. They weren't speaking as if he were family. They were speaking as if he were an obstacle, something to be managed, like a stubborn piece of land waiting to be bulldozed. His chest tightened, but he kept his expression still. Betrayal has a weight, and in that moment it settled over him twice as heavy, because it wasn't only his son who had turned cold, it was the entire circle orbiting around him. Outsiders, people who hadn't sacrificed a single hour, who hadn't bled to keep a roof overhead, now spoke with more authority about his future than he himself was allowed. He remembered how Michael had once clung to him as a boy, wide-eyed and trusting, believing his father's word was the sun by which the world turned. Now those same eyes avoided his, darting instead to Linda, to David, to Susan, as if seeking their approval rather than his. That realization cut deepest of all. Blood had been replaced by calculation. Loyalty had been traded for convenience. His son wasn't just distant. He was aligned with them, tethered to their ambitions and their whispered strategies. He could hear Linda again, her voice low but laced with disdain. "Once everything is signed, he won't have a say. Michael will be in control, and we can finally move forward." The words struck like hammer blows, each one clearer than the last. They weren't planning a life together. They were planning his removal, his erasure. He glanced toward the table, saw the way Susan's hand rested lightly on Linda's wrist, a gesture of maternal pride, of alliance, as though she had raised not just a daughter but an heir to power. David, with his polished composure, sat back like a man who already considered himself lord of the house. None of them looked at him, not directly, because people who plot against you rarely do. But he felt their presence all the same, as suffocating as a closed door. The father's jaw tightened. His life had been built on endurance, on learning how to carry weight most men would have collapsed under. He had carried mortgages, debts, the endless grind of work that left him bone-weary, so that his son could grow up free of those chains. Now strangers dared to speak of him as if he were already gone, as if his sacrifices had merely been a down payment for their comfort. He fought the urge to confront them then and there, to tear down the polite facade and expose every venomous word. But he held back. Not out of weakness, no, never weakness, but because he understood something deeper. If they thought he was powerless, invisible, they would reveal more. And the more they revealed, the more dangerous he would become. The betrayal clawed at him from the inside, but it also lit something he hadn't felt in years. A steady flame. Cold, deliberate. He knew now that this wasn't just neglect or thoughtless cruelty. It was design. They were orchestrating something, and his son was no longer his own man, but their pawn. That knowledge hardened him. They wanted him diminished. Instead, they had awakened a resolve that would not bend. Around him, the celebration carried on, oblivious. Music drifted in from the next room. Laughter rippled through the air, glasses clinked as toasts were made. But to the father, every sound was muted beneath the roar of realization. He was surrounded not by family but by predators who had mistaken his patience for surrender. He let his gaze rest on Michael just long enough for his son to feel it. Michael shifted uneasily, though he didn't meet his eyes. The father said nothing. Words weren't needed. Silence, sharpened to a blade, carried more weight than any speech. And in that silence he carved a vow deeper than any scar. They thought their whispers were safe. They thought their plots would pass unnoticed. They thought the father was too worn down, too forgotten to fight back. But they were wrong, and soon enough they would learn just how wrong. The room emptied around him, though it was still crowded with people. Every laugh, every burst of chatter seemed to come from a world sealed away, a place he could no longer enter. The father stood motionless, his back brushing against the cold plaster of the wall, the weight of absence pressing harder than any physical blow. He had lived through loss before, buried parents, buried friends, even buried pieces of himself when long years of work had ground him down to silence, but nothing compared to this. His son was alive, his blood still breathing, yet he felt as if he had lost him twice over. The loneliness crept in like a draft through broken windows, chilling him deeper than the evening air outside. He scanned the faces around the table where Michael and Linda laughed with David and Susan, their shoulders leaning close in the glow of polished candles. He wasn't just unwelcome. He was erased from the script of their lives. The man who had taught Michael how to throw a baseball, how to patch a tire, how to balance a checkbook was now reduced to nothing more than an unwanted presence, lingering at the edges of their celebration. He thought of the years when the house had been full of noise, when the kitchen smelled of Sunday roasts and his boy's voice bounced down the hallway. Now all of that echoed only inside him. He remembered nights when he came home bone-tired, his back screaming from hours on concrete floors, yet the moment Michael ran to him with a drawing or a story from school, the weight disappeared. That small boy's smile had been enough to fill an entire world. Standing here now, the absence of that bond hollowed him out. His hand brushed against his pocket where he kept a worn photograph folded so many times it was fraying at the edges. It was Michael at 12, holding a fishing rod almost too big for him, grinning as though the world itself had been caught on the hook. The father had been behind the camera that day, proud, alive, believing that bond was unbreakable. Looking at his son, now polished, distant, surrounded by people who looked at the father like a ghost, he realized that picture was not a memory anymore. It was a relic. The solitude pressed harder as the evening dragged on. No one spoke to him, not even the servers bustling in and out with trays of food. They had been instructed, it seemed, to treat him as invisible. He reached for a glass of water left on a side table, but even then, his hand trembled with the sharp sting of being overlooked. He was a man who had built a life from scraps, who had carried weight no one else dared touch. Yet here he stood, diminished by silence. In that silence, he heard the faintest echo of his late wife's voice, the one who had once whispered in the dark, reminding him that family was everything. She would have wept to see this, to see the boy they raised turn away. For a moment the father wished she had been there beside him to hold his hand through this exile. But she was gone, and so was the boy they thought they knew. All that remained was him, a man stranded in the ruins of his own devotion. The loneliness felt like drowning in air, each breath heavier than the last. He turned his eyes toward the window, catching the faint reflection of himself, lined face, tired eyes, shoulders sagging under a lifetime of giving. He barely recognized the man staring back. That man had been built for work, for sacrifice, for love of family. What was left for him now when the family itself had closed its doors? A burst of laughter broke his thoughts. Michael threw his head back, Linda's hand sliding across his shoulder, David nodding approvingly, Susan dabbing her lips with a linen napkin. The father's chest tightened, not from jealousy, but from the cold certainty that he was witnessing the replacement of his role. He was no longer the cornerstone. He was the outsider, the ghost at the feast. He felt a chair scrape against the floor behind him, but no one offered him a seat. No one asked if he was comfortable. He had become the man people avoided making eye contact with, the one whose presence unsettled the illusion of perfection they were so desperate to maintain. He realized with a chill that reached down to his bones that this was worse than death. Death was final, understood, mourned. This was erasure, a slow cutting away of everything he had been until there was nothing left but silence. But silence can be deceptive. Beneath it something stirred. Loneliness had carved him hollow, but in that hollow space something cold and precise began to form. The pain of losing his family once had nearly broken him. Losing them again in this way did something different. It hardened him. It forced clarity into his vision. He no longer expected love or loyalty from the son he had raised. He no longer looked for warmth from the family who had turned him out. What he saw now was truth stripped of illusion. And truth once seen could not be unseen. He pushed himself away from the wall, straightening his shoulders. The ache remained, but beneath it ran a new current, dark and steady. He would not forget the taste of this loneliness. He would not forget the sound of their laughter, as it excluded him the sight of his son bowing his head toward another man's approval. These moments would live inside him, fuel for what was to come. He moved through the room unnoticed, his steps silent against the polished floor. The air around him heavy with the perfume of roses and roasted meat. No one turned, no one called after him. He might as well have been air, and that suited him just fine. Because invisibility is a cloak, and cloaks can be powerful when the time comes to strike. Out in the night air, the cool wind wrapped around him, filling the hollowness with something sharper. He paused at the edge of the driveway, looking back at the house glowing warm with light. Inside, they believed they had won, that he was finished, that the erasure was complete. They had no idea that loneliness can sharpen into something far more dangerous than anger. The father stood there, silent eyes fixed on the glow of the windows, and made a vow that only the night could hear. What they thought was the end was only the pause before the storm. And soon the storm would break. His chest burned with the weight of fury, but no one in that room saw it. To them, he was nothing but a silent figure pressed against the wall, an afterthought with no voice left to raise. But beneath the stillness, beneath the quiet mask he wore, rage coiled itself tight like a steel spring. It begged to be unleashed, begged to rip through the fragile veneer of celebration and tear down the smug faces that surrounded his son. Yet he did not move. He did not give them the spectacle they wanted. Instead, he swallowed the fire and let it sink deeper, hardening into something colder, sharper, more dangerous. Michael laughed at a joke his father could not hear, leaning into Linda's ear, his hand brushing her shoulder with a show of ease that twisted the knife deeper. Linda's parents raised their glasses, smug smiles glimmering in the chandelier light. Each movement was an insult, each wordless dismissal a reminder of his exile. The father's fists ached from being clenched too long at his sides, but he loosened them with deliberate control. He would not lash out here. He would not give them proof of the weakness they wanted to see. Inside his skull, memories and calculations collided like sparks. He thought of the mortgage papers he had kept hidden in the locked drawer at home, the quiet investments made over decades, the debts he had paid in silence while Michael basked in the illusion of freedom. He thought of every night he had stayed awake, numbers scribbled on lined paper, sacrifices carved into flesh and bone, so his son would never know what it meant to go without. That anger, that betrayal, he pressed it down, not to forget it, but to preserve it. Because anger that erupts dies in an instant. Anger that is caged becomes strategy. The father's eyes tracked Michael as he moved through the room. Charming guests, shaking hands, smiling with a confidence that was no longer his own, but borrowed from those who now pulled his strings. Every gesture screamed of ownership, not earned but gifted by the manipulation of outsiders. It made the father's jaw tighten until he thought his teeth might break. Still, he remained silent. His mind shifted to the house, his house that stood as proof of decades of sacrifice. He could almost see it now, the worn porch, the familiar creak of the floorboards, the smell of oak and dust. It wasn't just wood and nails. It was his life, his sweat soaked into the walls. And yet here he was, listening to whispers of signatures and transfers as if it had already been claimed by hands that had never lifted a hammer or carried a single brick. The fury inside him surged, but he chained it back down. He drew in a slow breath, steady, deliberate. Around him the party spun on. To them, his silence was defeat. They mistook restraint for surrender, mistook patience for frailty. He let them believe it. He let Linda smirk across the table. Let David and Susan exchange sly looks. Let Michael bask in the glow of borrowed approval. Because he knew something they didn't. Storms that break suddenly are loud, but storms that build in silence leave devastation no one sees coming. The father shifted his stance, planting his weight firmly into the floor as though grounding himself against the tide of humiliation pressing in on him. He thought of his late wife, of her voice urging him to choose his battles wisely. He remembered her telling him once long ago that true power is not in the shout but in the wait. He hadn't understood it then. He understood it now. Every second stretched, every sound sharpened, every face in the room etched itself into his memory. He was storing them, all of them, in the vault of his mind, preparing for the day they would matter. He would not forget Linda's calculating eyes, David's smug posture, Susan's whispered approval. He would not forget the way his son had chosen them over blood. Each detail was fuel, each moment a brick in the foundation of something greater. He exhaled slowly, the faintest smile ghosting across his face. Not the smile of joy or surrender, but the cold smile of a man who has chosen not to strike yet. To anyone watching, it might have looked like nothing at all, a tired man lost in thought. But inside, the silence roared. The father turned away from the table, his steps measured, his movements calm. He slipped from the glow of the chandelier into the edge of shadow, where no one bothered to look. There, away from their eyes, he let the fury fill him, not to consume, but to carve him into something unrecognizable. He felt the weight of years of labor in his shoulders, the ache of betrayal in his chest, and he reshaped them into armor. He would not fall apart. He would not beg for a place. He would build something stronger, sharper, and when the time came, they would never see it coming. Outside, the laughter carried on, careless and cruel. Inside him, a vow formed steady as stone. He would not explode tonight. He would not give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. But the reckoning had already begun in silence, and when it finally arrived, it would come like thunder after the stillest air. And as he stood in that quiet corner, rage-caged and sharpened, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. They believed they had stripped him of power, but all they had done was give him reason. And reason, when paired with patience, was far more dangerous than fury unleashed. The image of his son as a boy rose unbidden, sharp against the present humiliation. He remembered a summer evening long ago when the sky was painted in streaks of gold and violet, and Michael wobbled on a rusted bicycle, the training wheels finally gone. The boy's knees were scraped, his face flushed, but his eyes were wide with determination. The father had jogged alongside, hand gripping the back of the seat, steadying every sway until the boy found balance. When Michael finally pedaled on his own, the wind catching his laughter, he had turned back and shouted, "Dad, I'll always be there." The words had been pure, unguarded, a promise wrapped in innocence. That promise now echoed in the hollow of the father's chest, bitter and broken, replaced by silence, colder than any winter. He remembered nights when money was scarce, when dinner was little more than canned beans and bread. Yet those meals, humble and modest, had been filled with warmth. Michael would chatter about school, about dreams of being an astronaut or a ball player, and the father would nod, smiling through exhaustion, hiding the ache of hunger in his own belly, so his boy could eat a little more. They had sat in that small kitchen with its flickering light, and the father had thought that despite the cracked linoleum and overdue bills, life was rich because love filled the gaps. Now he stood in a room glittering with wealth and polish, surrounded by abundance, and never had life felt emptier. The contrast tore at him, each memory striking harder than the last. He saw the little boy running across a rain-soaked field, shoes, too small hair plastered to his forehead, grinning as he held up a cheap trophy from a Little League game. The father had stood there drenched, clapping until his palms stung the proudest man alive. That same boy now turned away from him, finding validation in the eyes of strangers, discarding the man who had stood in every storm. The weight of that betrayal was heavier than the years of labor that had bent his back and scarred his hands. He recalled the nights spent on the living room couch, Michael asleep against his chest, the sound of cartoons fading from the television. He remembered whispering promises into the boy's hair that he would protect him, that he would give him the life he never had, that no sacrifice was too great. And for years he had kept that vow. Every sacrifice was made in silence, without expectation of thanks, because he believed the bond itself was unbreakable. To see it now severed not by accident but by choice turned those whispered promises into ghosts that haunted him. The warmth of the past pressed against the icy present, the clash almost unbearable. He looked at Michael, his polished suit, his hollow smile, the coldness in his gaze, and could no longer reconcile the boy he had raised with the man before him. They were not the same. Somewhere along the way the laughter had dulled, the gratitude had withered, and the bond had been traded for something shallow, something transactional. It was as if the boy had been buried, replaced by a stranger who shared his face, but none of his heart. The father's chest tightened with grief, but grief gave way to something sharper. Nostalgia was a double-edged blade. It reminded him of what was lost, but it also carved clarity into his vision. He understood now that love, once unconditional, had been weaponized against him. The promises of the past had been nothing more than fragile illusions. The contrast between then and now made the truth impossible to ignore. The boy, who once promised never to leave, had chosen to stand with those who wanted him erased. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the memory surge, not to weaken him, but to remind him of what had been stolen. He could still hear the echo of a small voice calling Dad across a field, could still feel the tug of a tiny hand gripping his as they crossed a busy street, could still see the sleepy smile of a child drifting off in safety. And when he opened his eyes, he saw only distant betrayal and strangers laughing at a table where he no longer belonged. The ache of that comparison hardened into steel. The room felt colder, though the fire burned in the hearth and the chandeliers blazed overhead. Wealth glittered around him, but it was nothing but a hollow shell compared to the warmth of those meager dinners long ago. He realized then that happiness had never been in abundance but in connection, and connection was gone, ripped from him by the very people he had trusted most. He stood straighter, shoulders squaring, his expression unreadable. To the others he looked like a man resigned, but inside a storm was tightening its grip. The past had given him love. The present had given him betrayal. Together they had given him reason. Reason to act, reason to plan, reason to ensure that this betrayal would not go unanswered. Every memory was a spark, every contrast a blade. He carried them not as weights, but as weapons, silent for now, waiting for the moment when they would be unleashed. And as he watched his son turn away again, laughing at something whispered by Linda, the father knew one thing with chilling certainty: the past might be gone, but it had left him with the sharpest tool of all, the clarity of what needed to come next. His eyes locked on his son's face, the noise of the room dissolving into a muted hum. Michael laughed at something Linda whispered, but when his gaze drifted for half a second toward the corner where his father stood, he found eyes that didn't waver. The father's stare was steady, unflinching, carrying the weight of decades. And then, almost imperceptibly, his mouth curved into a smile. Not the warm smile of a parent, not the soft forgiveness Michael had grown accustomed to, but a blade disguised as a grin. It was the kind of smile that promised nothing and threatened everything. Michael faltered just for a moment before forcing the laughter back onto his lips. He looked away too quickly, a man who had caught a glimpse of something he couldn't name. The father let the smile linger, a sliver of irony stretched across a face carved from endurance. That small act was enough, because behind it the decision had been made. The humiliation he had endured tonight would not be the final word. It would be the beginning. Every smirk, every whispered insult, every deliberate erasure had been etched into him, and now they would be repaid in kind. The father didn't feel rage boiling over anymore. Rage was wild, uncontrollable. What he felt now was colder, clearer, a calculation settling into place like stones in a foundation. He would not scream. He would not beg. He would not lash out like a man with nothing left. Instead, he would move like the man he had always been, deliberate, methodical, patient. The plan was already forming in his mind, each piece sliding into place with unnerving precision. He thought of the documents tucked away in his desk, the property deeds still in his name, The quiet accounts Linda and her family knew nothing about. They believed he was powerless, that his worth began and ended with the house they wanted to claim. They couldn't have been more wrong. What they saw tonight was an old man cornered and humiliated. What they didn't see was the years he had spent building more than walls and roofs. He had built contingencies, lifelines, hidden reserves of strength that no one in this room could even imagine. The father's eyes followed Linda as she leaned into Michael, whispering again, her painted lips curving into that familiar smirk. He could almost hear the venom laced in her voice, the quiet conviction that she had already won. Let her believe it. Let her savor her false triumph. When the ground gave way beneath her, when the foundation of her schemes cracked open, the fall would be harder because of how high she thought she stood. He straightened his shoulders, the weight of loneliness shifting into armor. No one noticed the change. To them, he was still the shadow at the edge of the room, silent, diminished. But inside, something irreversible had turned. This was no longer a man clinging to hope of reconciliation. This was a man sharpening silence into a weapon. He remembered the years of struggle, not with sorrow now, but with purpose. Every hour on a construction site, every late-night calculation at the kitchen table, every sacrifice he had made was no longer just a history of devotion. It was a ledger. And ledgers are meant to be balanced. They had taken from him respect, dignity, even blood. Now he would collect. The chandelier's light fractured across the glass in his hand, scattering into shards of gold. He lifted it slowly, not to toast, not to join the celebration, but to study the reflection of his son across the room. Michael was smiling again, buoyed by the voices around him, blind to the storm that had just been set into motion. The father lowered the glass untouched and set it back on the table with deliberate care. It was a small act, but in his mind it marked the line. The moment before becomes the past. The moment after is the reckoning. He let the noise of the room wash over him one final time. The laughter, the clinking of forks, the murmured plans that excluded him. Each sound hardened his resolve. He was no longer waiting for acceptance. He was preparing for retribution. His gaze cut back to Michael once more, holding there until his son, perhaps drawn by instinct, looked his way again. The father's smile deepened just slightly, enough to chill, enough to unsettle. Michael looked away first, breaking the contact. That was all the father needed. Because now he knew with absolute clarity the next chapter would not be written in whispers behind his back. It would be written by his hand, carved into the lives of those who thought they had erased him. And as he turned from the room, steps steady and unhurried, one thought burned brighter than any humiliation, louder than any silence. They had mistaken survival for surrender. But survival is only the first act. The real story was about to begin, and they would never see it coming. The realization struck him not as a single blow, but as a series of sharp cuts, each deeper than the last. He had known betrayal, had tasted humiliation, but this was something darker. It wasn't just that Michael had grown cold, or that Linda and her parents sneered at him from across the table. It was the revelation that all of them, his own blood included, were united not by love or loyalty, but by hunger. Hunger for the very life he had built, for the walls he had raised with his hands, for the money he had scraped together through decades of sacrifice. They didn't merely want to push him aside. They wanted to consume everything he had, leave him stripped bare, nothing more than a shadow of the man who had once carried them. His chest burned as the truth solidified. Michael wasn't simply indifferent. He was complicit. He had let himself be molded, reshaped, pulled into the orbit of Linda's family until his voice no longer carried the weight of his father's lessons. It carried the echo of David's smug pragmatism, of Susan's manipulative whispers, of Linda's ambition wrapped in a sweet smile. The father saw it clearly now. They weren't satisfied with erasing him from a wedding or excluding him from a table. They wanted the deeds, the accounts, the last remnants of his legacy. The air around him shifted. Where grief had once pressed, resolve now coiled. This wasn't just about pride anymore. This was about war. And wars are not fought with shouts across a table or bitter words flung in anger. Wars are won in silence and shadows in the places where plans are forged, while enemies are still celebrating. He thought of the files locked in his study drawer, bank statements, carefully tucked away assets. Linda's family knew nothing about properties bought under names they had never heard. They saw him as a man clinging desperately to one house, blind to the fact that his life's work sprawled further deeper, hidden from their greedy hands. They wanted to strip him of everything, but they didn't even know the size of the empire they sought to claim. That ignorance was his weapon. His mind sharpened with detail. Every sacrifice, every hidden investment, every favor owed to him by men who still remembered his integrity, became pieces of the board. He realized now that the humiliation they had delivered tonight was not an end, but a beginning. It was the spark that lit the fuse, and once lit, there was no extinguishing it. The father studied them again, his eyes lingering on Linda's triumphant smirk, on Susan's approving nod, on David's quiet arrogance, and finally on Michael, his son, who had traded blood for convenience. Each of their faces imprinted themselves into his memory, not as family, not as in-laws, but as adversaries. Adversaries who believed they had already won. Adversaries who had no idea the battle had only just begun. He leaned back against the cold wall, his posture still, his expression unreadable. To anyone watching, he looked tired, defeated, a man retreating into himself. But inside, something alive and feral stirred. The betrayal had lit a fire that would not burn out until it had consumed every false smile, every greedy hand, every piece of their illusion of power. He remembered the first time Michael had asked him about money. The boy had been barely 18, desperate for cash to impress someone at college. The father had handed it over without hesitation, believing it was just a step toward independence. But now he saw the pattern, the growing sense of entitlement, the ease with which his son had let others shape his priorities. It wasn't sudden. It had been building all along, and he had ignored it, blinded by love. That blindness was gone now, seared away by tonight's revelation. The room seemed to pulse with false light. Glasses clinked, laughter swelled, plans whispered under chandeliers. They thought they had silenced him. They thought they had pushed him into irrelevance. But the silence was not surrender. It was the coiling of a spring, the gathering of a storm. He knew something they didn't. Once a man has nothing left to lose, he becomes untouchable. But he had more than nothing. He had secrets. He had resources. He had patience. And those made him dangerous. His heart slowed, not from calm, but from clarity. Rage had burned off its wild edges, leaving only precision. He was no longer thinking of tonight's slights. He was thinking of the weeks ahead, the months, the careful moves that would unravel their schemes one thread at a time. He could already picture it. Linda's smirk faltering, David's certainty crumbling, Susan's whisper turning into a gasp, and Michael standing alone in the ruins of what he had chosen, finally understanding the cost of betrayal. The father allowed the faintest hint of a smile to touch his lips again, sharp and knowing. No one noticed. They were too busy basking in their illusion of victory, too drunk on their own ambition. That was their weakness, and he would exploit it. The fire inside him no longer raged out of control. It had settled into something steadier, something unstoppable. They thought they had cornered him, but all they had done was light the match. And when the flames finally rose, they would not see them coming until it was too late. For now he remained in the shadows, a figure forgotten at the edge of the room. But within him, the plan was already alive, already burning. The betrayal had given him clarity, and clarity had given him purpose. And as he turned his eyes away from their laughter, he felt the weight of inevitability pressing forward. They believed the future was theirs to claim. They were wrong. The future was his to take back, and the reckoning when it came would not be small. It would be absolute. He stood alone in the shadows, the sound of clinking glasses and hollow laughter echoing behind him like the distant rattle of chains. His eyes were fixed on the faint reflection in the window, the outline of a man who had been written off, dismissed, humiliated by his own flesh and blood. But in the reflection he no longer saw defeat. He saw something sharpened, honed by pain and betrayal, into an edge that could cut through steel. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but the words carried a weight that could have split the silence in two. They thought I was weak, but they have no idea what's coming. The words weren't meant for them. They weren't meant to be heard above the music and chatter of the room. They were meant for himself, a vow spoken into the dark, a promise carved into the air like an oath. The bitterness of humiliation had crystallized into resolve, and in that moment, he ceased to be the victim they thought they had broken. He became the architect of their downfall. He stepped away from the window, his movements calm, deliberate, each stride carrying the weight of intention. He walked past the table where Linda leaned close to whisper into Susan's ear, past the smirk that curled David's lips, past the forced grin on Michael's face as he pretended not to feel the stare that burned into his back. None of them noticed the shift, the quiet storm gathering beneath his stillness. They thought the night had ended with their triumph. In truth, it was the prologue. As he moved through the house, his mind stretched forward past the chandeliers and the polished floors, past the false toasts and empty speeches. He saw the days ahead unfolding like a chessboard, each move already forming in the recesses of his mind. Every slight, every insult, every whispered scheme was a piece he would turn against them. He knew their greed, their arrogance, their blind confidence that he had no fight left, and that blindness would be their undoing. Outside, the night air struck cold against his face, but it only fueled him. The wind carried the faintest trace of pine and smoke, grounding him in a world beyond their illusions. He looked back at the house, glowing warm in the dark, a beacon of false unity, of celebration built on betrayal. They believed that light belonged to them, now that he had been cast out of it forever. But light is fragile. It takes only one shadow to shift its shape, one storm to snuff it out. His hands tightened at his sides, not with rage, but with certainty. For years he had lived in service to others, every dollar earned bent toward someone else's dream, every sacrifice made so that another could rise. They mistook that giving for weakness. They mistook patience for surrender. Tonight had shown him the truth. They would take everything if he let them. They would strip him bare until nothing remained but memory. He would not allow it. He began the slow walk down the gravel drive, each crunch beneath his shoes sounding like the punctuation of a vow. The future no longer belonged to them. It belonged to him, to the man they had underestimated, the father they believed too old, too weary, too broken to fight. They had given him the greatest weapon of all, the certainty that there was nothing left to lose except dignity, and that dignity would be reclaimed no matter the cost. In the quiet, he pictured their faces at the moment the balance shifted. Linda's smirk curdling into shock, Susan's whispers faltering into silence, David's arrogance crumbling under the weight of exposure, and Michael, his son, standing in the wreckage of the choices he had made, finally forced to confront the cost of betrayal. That moment would come. He would make sure of it. The night seemed to breathe around him, the darkness carrying his vow further than walls or ears could reach. They thought the story was finished, that the final chapter had been written in his absence. But the pages were still blank, and he now held the pen. Every step away from that house was not retreat, but preparation, not surrender, but declaration. He let the silence envelop him, felt the stillness sharpen into resolve. He didn't need their acknowledgement anymore. He didn't need their approval. All he needed was time. And time was already bending toward him. They thought I was weak. He repeated in his mind the words steady, ironclad. But weakness bends. Weakness breaks. And he was neither. He was the quiet before the collapse, the shadow before the strike. And when the strike came, it would not be loud. It would not be wild. It would be precise, devastating, final. The kind of reckoning that could not be undone. The house behind him glowed softer as he walked further into the dark, its laughter fading, its music dying against the stillness of the night. He didn't look back again. Back. There was no need. Because everything behind those walls already belonged to him. not in possession, but in inevitability. They just didn't know it yet. And so he disappeared into the night, carrying with him the fire they had sparked, the vow they had forced into existence, and the certainty that soon, very soon, the reckoning they could not imagine would arrive. Life has a way of revealing who truly stands beside us, and sometimes the deepest wounds come not from strangers, but from those we raised and trusted most. The story of a father cast aside by his own son is more than just family drama. It is a reminder that love without respect can be exploited, and silence mistaken for weakness. For older generations who have given so much of their lives to support children and build legacies, the lesson is clear. Never undervalue yourself and never assume that sacrifice guarantees gratitude. Protect what you've built, hold firm to your dignity, and remember that age does not strip you of strength. Even in betrayal, there is power in patience, wisdom in restraint, and the possibility of turning pain into purpose. Life may try to silence you, but resilience is the greatest inheritance you can leave behind. If this story moved you, share where you're watching from or leave a simple number in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of these powerful life lessons.